Okay, this is interesting here because you basically had the defense calling out the prosecution, saying that the doctor is the only credible witness that the defense has in their case. And he's saying, look, that is not true. He again is sort of pointing the suspect to be potentially other people in these homes surrounded by these women. Joining me now to break all of this down is Tara Walsh, criminal defense attorney. So Tara, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
You're a criminal defense attorney, so listening to the defense's closing arguments so far, what are you thinking here? Is this method effective? Is it working for him?
Well, clearly the defense here is one of identity. And the defense attorney is arguing that his client was not the person that committed these crimes. So I think in introducing this testimony from these mental health experts, as he's referred to them, is to suggest that in evaluating this defendant and determining whether in fact he had any sort of mental illness, that perhaps he was not capable of forming the intent to commit these crimes, and therefore he could not have been the person to commit these crimes. I think that's where he's headed. And
do you think that the jury's receiving it that way?
I think it's a risk. I think it could be potentially confusing for a jury because on the one hand, the defense attorney is arguing that he could not have committed these crimes, but then to delve into such detail with these mental health experts on his mental state and presumably any violent tendencies that he may have had, could really work in the opposite direction and perhaps raise more questions in their mind with regard to whether he was capable of doing this given his prior history.
And one of the things we know is that there was no DNA evidence connecting Gargiulo to the death of Ashley Ellerin. And we heard him bring that up. He's going to bring it up again. So let's listen to this now where he touches on Ellerin's death. Okay, so again, we are listening to the defense's closing arguments in the Hollywood Ripper trial. This, I thought, was more effective on his part, Tara. The defense attorney basically brings up that key point that there is no evidence linking Gargiulo to the Ellerin murder. And he repeats that several times. He says that there's no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no hair samples, et cetera, et cetera. So he goes on to highlight all that. This, more effective, arguably?
Yes, absolutely. And if I were trying this case, I'd be doing the same exact thing. I'd be pointing out every single weakness in the state's case with respect to each and every victim. This is certainly the strongest of that. However, there are other victims in the case, and I'm sure that the state is focusing on the motives and the way that those crimes were committed and connecting the weaknesses in this case to the strengths in the other cases.
We'll have to see if he goes on to talk about the other victims here, because we don't know if he's going to touch on all of those and, as you said, point out those weaknesses. But when you hear what you have now with the defense closing so far, I think he's doing a pretty good job. Yes, compared to what we said before.
Right, especially with respect to this particular victim. I mean, he really is pointing out the lack of physical evidence, the lack of eyewitnesses. There really isn't anything else connecting this particular defendant to that crime, to that particular crime. But I'm sure the jury is sitting there thinking about these other victims and the similarities in the way these crimes were committed, and that will ultimately be their call to determine whether or not they were similar enough so that they can actually make a decision whether he's guilty in that particular case.
All right, Tara, thanks. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Okay, so the defense really going on here to try to cast that reasonable doubt again. He mentions how the evidence that was collected, some of it had no sign, nothing of being connected to Gargiulo. So, Tara, when you listen to this, this is pretty convincing here because he really does a great job of talking about these specific things that were pulled from the apartment and had no sign of Gargiulo on them. One of them being the bathrobe, but he talks more.
Right. So one thing that he did do, he started to mention everything that was tested by the detectives, and he does specifically mention the bathrobe, but then he actually presents a question to the jury and says, what else was done, the doors, and then sort of trailed off. So to me, that's not as effective as actually going through every single item that was tested and letting the jury know how many items were tested and that they all failed to test positive for any DNA that came from his client. I mean, if I were him, I actually would have pulled out those evidence receipts, showed them to the jury, showed them every single item that was recovered and tested, and that none of them came back. That's something he didn't do. I thought it would have been more effective if he had.
Especially with those visuals, jury always loves seeing those props.
Right, exactly.
All right, let's listen to what else he continues to say after that. All right, so more from the defense's closing arguments there. And this is interesting because he lays out and mentions the other 3 people that could have done this, one of them being Ashton Kutcher, basically. And he says Ashton Kutcher is a star witness here, which I thought was interesting. Why did he do that?
You know, I think he might be playing on the celebrity a little bit here, and maybe a little bit of wordplay, you know, suggesting that he's the star witness. I think perhaps that may have been a little use of sarcasm on his point, you know, and that he's a celebrity. Perhaps he has other interests in this case. Perhaps that's where he was headed with his argument. I don't see how yet he's really connected Ashton Kutcher in any way, shape, or form as being a suspect in this case.
And did it work for you with what we just listened? You mentioned he didn't really connect, didn't do what we wanted to hear, I don't think.
Right. I don't think it was successful.
And when we're talking about this trial as a whole, you know, this trial has been going on since May, so it has been a long time. Obviously, it is a, you know, double murder with the attempted murder charge here, but, you know, it's finally wrapping. And after this trial wraps, Gargiulo is going back on trial for the 4th murder that he's accused of in Chicago. How does that play in with all this?
Right. So, you know, the crime in Chicago, I know, had come up in the case in LA, and specifically for the purpose that it was committed in a similar fashion. And, you know, I wouldn't be shocked if the same did not happen in Chicago, in that the prosecutor in Chicago would refer back to the crimes that were committed in LA. As a defense attorney, you know, I'm sure they were making 404B motions with respect to what's called other crime evidence in an attempt to exclude that type of evidence. Given the fact that the Chicago crime evidence was allowed in the LA trial, given the similarity in the crimes and the way that they were committed, I'm sure the same can anticipate it to be happen in Chicago.
All right, Tara, thank you so much. Coming up, we're going to actually switch gears and talk about Eric Boyd's trial. That is the trial in Tennessee that we've been telling you about. Today is day 3 of that trial. And of course, he's the man accused of the gruesome murders of Shannon Christian and her boyfriend, Christopher Newsom. That happened back in 2007. We will continue to follow that trial when we come back. Stay with us here on Law and Crime.